Hey guys, welcome back to the Far Better Podcast. I am your host, Michael Clarke, and this is probably a lot different than normal, but I think it'd be funny to just kind of let you know what's happening right now. My dad and I were supposed to record this a couple of weeks ago, but he went overseas to India, and then our travel schedules did not link up. We're driving home right now from a weekend getaway with my son and his grandson, Adam. And as we're driving down the road, we just decided, hey, no time like the present to go ahead and hit record. So we've done the best we can with the audio that we've got. And we're going to be talking today about the final define and defeat of this season. And that is a understanding of looking at the man of sin. And the reason that I've asked my dad to be on this particular episode, as I've mentioned before, you wrote your thesis on this. And so why don't you go ahead and just kind of tell everybody a little bit about the background of why you selected this topic, what you were going through in school that made you navigate towards the study of the man of sin.
Sure. I was actually driving down the road listening to Brother Franklin Camp's audio series through the Bible, and I was listening to Second Thessalonians chapter 2, not for any assignment or for any particular reason. And he said something that just really floored me because I had always heard and always taught that the man of sin in Second Thessalonians 2 was probably the Roman Catholic Pope or papacy as a whole, because that's what I'd always heard from very good brethren. Brother Camp's a good brother also, and he said something that got my attention. He said the Pope was never in the church, and yet most people would take the phrase in Second Thessalonians 2, sat in the temple as God, as a reference to the Pope sitting in the church. But Brother Camp pointed out the Pope was never in the church of our Lord Jesus Christ. By the time the papacy developed, the church had long since ceased being the Lord's church and had turned into a denominational setting. And so he suggested that the Jewish high priest would be a particular candidate for the man of sin and the man of lawlessness. And so I decided to explore that as my thesis just to see what it would lead me to. And it was a very, very rewarding study.
If I remember correctly, is it 80 plus pages or more than that?
As actually over 100 pages. Yeah, that
Okay.
was the assignment. It had to be 100 plus.
So anybody that's ever done a thesis before can certainly relate to the pressure and the studies and the hours of work that goes into something like this. And certainly on a topic that is, as you mentioned, somewhat obscure in its understanding outside of Brother Camp. You had said that you'd never really heard about that line of thinking prior to that, but then this yielded quite a lot, over 100 pages. I mean, I would imagine if you had gotten halfway through it and said, there's nothing, I can't find a single thing to support this, you would have had to have tried to change your thesis and figure out how to go about that. So you clearly found a lot of material that supported this mindset.
Yeah, well, there's so many theories about the man of lawlessness or the man of sin, as he's sometimes called. McGarvey actually observes that there are three basic views of the man of sin in the commentaries that are written about 2 Thessalonians 2. One is that this prophecy has long since been fulfilled. Some regard it as in the process of fulfillment. And there are others who think, well, it's not even close to being fulfilled. It's going to be fulfilled way off in the distant future.
So if we think about the man of sin from the mindset of the papacy, talk for just a moment about why that seems to be such a common understanding of the man of sin, why people so long have gravitated to that.
when you look at the text in 2 Thessalonians 2 and some of the characteristics of the man of sin, there's an arrogance there. He is depicted as sitting as if he were God in the temple, and he is a deceiver. And there are seems to be indications in the text that he's elevated himself to a position that's not lawfully his, thus a man of lawlessness. In fact, a lot of people have been nominated over the years because of their rebellious spirit. For example, Antiochus Epiphanes, Daniel 11:37 to 41 is a section of scripture that describes arrogance of Antiochus Epiphanes. And there is a great similarity between some of the language you read in 2 Thessalonians 2, 3 and 4, and Daniel 11:37 to 41. And so some people suggested that Antiochus Epiphanes might have been the man of lawlessness, but of course, that's not possible that he was the man of lawlessness spoken of by Paul, because he existed long before Paul ever did. And so that he can't be the one that was in view in 2 Thessalonians 2. Some said Caligula was the man of lawlessness because he actually ordered prayers to be addressed to him. He tried to have a statue of himself erected in the Jewish temple. And Morris, in his commentary, actually noted that setting up an image is not the same as sitting there himself. And so Caligula died in AD 41, about 10 years before 1 Thessalonians was even written, so he can't be the one. Some thought, well, okay, maybe he's a Roman emperor or a particular Roman emperor like Nero. It's true that the Roman emperors were extremely arrogant. They did take to themselves positions of authority and titles that didn't belong to them. Domitian, for example, made some of the most aggressive claims to deity. But there's good reason to believe that the Roman emperors are not the man of lawlessness, because they never were in the temple, physical, or in the church. And there's more than that about it. Now, wickedness is certainly a part of the lawlessness of the Roman Catholic papacy as well. Emperors and Roman Catholic popes both demonstrated some arrogance. Now, you asked the question, why do some people gravitate to the papacy? In the year 991, there was a Bishop Arnulf who attacked John the 15th with this statement. He said, "Reverend fathers, who do you think he is, this man sitting in the highest chair, dressed in purple and glowing with gold? Doubtless, if he's bereft of charity and blown up and lifted on high with knowledge alone, he is Antichrist, seated in the temple of God and showing himself as if he were God." It was very common for people to think the papacy and the man of sin and the Antichrist were all one and the same, even though the man of sin and the Antichrist can have similarities, but are really two different approaches in New Testament teaching on that. So the view became popular among the Protestant reformers. Martin Luther was very much of the view that the Pope was the Antichrist or man of sin, and that was such a prominent interpretation, it actually became known as the Protestant interpretation. So you had quite a few people believing that.
And I don't want to belabor the point on the Antichrist. I know on this podcast, we've done a lot of study on the Antichrist, but it does strike me as odd when one of the main tenets of the belief of the Antichrist is he will rise to power and then all of these bad things will follow. We have had how many popes now? and how many different iterations of one entity that, by all accounts, has already risen to the highest level of power I could see it having at the time that a lot of this was written, and yet the Pope never was able to take over the world, which would indicate that maybe the Pope is not the Antichrist, and therefore it couldn't be seen that way, and the man of sin would have to be seen differently, or man of lawlessness, as you mentioned. I'm glad you touched on that. They all kind of get lumped together at times, because a lot of the study in the Antichrist will lead down Nero, Antiochus Epiphanes, and some of those same names, because it's usually lumped together.
Yeah.
When you think about the popularity of this view, I would imagine because Catholicism has certainly done a lot of harm to the church and the viewpoint of what the scriptures teach, it's an easy thing to latch on to say, we want to destroy a false doctrine like that and hold on to the viewpoint that the man of sin would be the Pope. What would be the beginning process of starting to kind of think differently, not unscripturally, but differently than we've always been told, based on what you've discovered in your studies, that would lean more towards what Brother Camp first suggested to you?
Yeah, you got to look for someone that has some of the similar characteristics. It was a man by the name of Thomas Newton who was a very big proponent of the papal Antichrist view. And one thing I wanted to mention is you did a good job of capturing the way the world paints the view of Antichrist. But as you well know, and if I'm sure
Right.
covered in your broadcast, your program, that Antichrist in the New Testament was never featured as some kind of singular figure who would be some sinister, charismatic, cruel tyrant. It was someone that didn't believe Jesus Christ had come in the flesh, and there were many of them
Right.
in the New Testament, according to 2 John and 3 John. But at any rate, as you note, the question that you ask, I started looking at what Brother Camp pointed out, and I started realizing that the arrogance of the Jewish high priest makes much more sense, because the people in Thessalonica had heard, according to 2 Timothy, or make it 2 Thessalonians 2 and verse 5, they had actually heard about some things that Paul was talking about in 2 Thessalonians 2. At the time that Paul was talking to the Thessalonians in about AD 51 and before, the Pope was not even a thing. He didn't even exist yet. So, but what we do have is, interestingly, a lot of similarities between Jesus's warnings about the coming destruction of Jerusalem and 2 Thessalonians 2. For instance, Jesus told his disciples, "Take heed that no man deceive you," Matthew 24:4. And then Paul admonished the Thessalonians, "Let no man deceive you by any means," 2 Thessalonians 2:3. Jesus warned that some would come claiming to be deity, deceiving many, verse 5 of Matthew 24. Paul said the man of sin would claim for himself prerogatives of deity and deceive many, 2 Thessalonians 2:4 and 9-12. Jesus said, "Don't be shaken or troubled by wars or rumors of wars." And he used a word there in Matthew 24:6 that Paul used when he exhorted his readers to avoid being shaken or troubled by events that surrounded them, 2 Thessalonians 2:3-8. Jesus said many false prophets would come and deceive many, Matthew 24:11. Paul says one coming after Satan would deceive many, 2 Thessalonians 2:9-12. Jesus said iniquity would abound, the love of many would wax cold. The word he used for iniquity, anomion, which is the same word translated lawlessness And Paul used it to refer to the man of lawlessness. And so Jesus told his hearers the coming of the end would be restrained until the gospel had been preached to all nations, Matthew 24:14. Paul told the readers of 2 Thessalonians that verse 8, the events of verse 8 could not happen until the restraining factor was removed. And so many example after example after example. For example, Jesus reminded his hearers, I've told you these things before, Matthew 24:25. In 2 Thessalonians 2:5, Paul says to his readers, I've told you these things before. So there are just too many similarities to not at least start going down that path.
I like how you pointed out not just what the text says that's similar, but the original language that conveys the same word being used in one place and then another, with us knowing what 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17 describes about the Word of God. It's inspired by Him. It gives all of the information we need that the man of God can be complete, meaning the same Spirit that would have inspired Matthew to write down what was being talked about is the same Spirit that inspires Paul. He doesn't ask him to pick the same word on accident. He doesn't ask him to pick the same types of language and the same types of phraseology by accident, or allow the phraseologies to come out of the writer and his own style by accident. And so I love that doesn't just mean a statement of B.J. Clarke and Franklin Camp thought it would be really cool for the man of sin to be the Jewish high priest, so we're going to try to puzzle piece this and fit it in a way that doesn't actually make a lot of sense. There's a lot of merit to what you're saying based on the text, not just what you think the text should say.
And that's what Brother Camp really was known for, is sticking to the text and following it where it would have led in the same century in which it was written. And for example, the temple that's in view in 2 Thessalonians 2, that this man of God is, or man of sin rather, is sitting in as if he were God. The church cannot be the temple, though the church is sometimes figuratively referred to as the temple. It's never used that way to refer to a denomination. And the Pope was never in the Lord's church. He was in a denomination. And when you read 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 4, you've got the premillennialists who think that this is a future temple that hasn't even been built yet. John Walvoord actually had an article in April of 1968 in which he was citing, quote, authoritative sources in Sellersburg, Indiana, that 500 railroad carloads of stone from Bedford, Indiana, were already en route to Israel, and that a portion of it had arrived in Israel. 2 bronze pillars for the new temple had already been cast. And this was 1968. We're almost 50 years. In fact, we are almost 60 years away from that time period. And that temple still hasn't been built. There's another possibility, and that is that the Jewish temple in which the Jewish high priest sat in his royal garb, as he saw it, it was prescribed by God that he have a specific kind of dress under the Old Testament system. But the Old Testament had been nailed to the cross, and yet you still got a temple in Jerusalem offering animal sacrifices, and a man showing up to work every day called the Jewish high priest after Jesus, our high priest, had already ascended into the heavens.
It reminds me, for just a trivial illustration, nowhere near the same level spiritually, but it just reminded me from being a child of the Lion King, where Scar tries to take the throne that wasn't his to take. And the whole point of that movie is restoring the rightful king to the rightful throne. And though that is a kid's movie and it has no bearing on our spirituality on the Day of Judgment, it's not a thought that was original to Hollywood. It was actually happening. in other cases, in other situations, not just in a trivial place of a kingdom, but there was an individual who was proposing themselves to be something that they weren't, trying to take glory away from the rightful person and deity that deserved that glory. And it was a problem enough that the Holy Spirit determined that it needed to be written about, needed to be covered, and it was all covered. The thing that has always stuck with me from the time that you taught this to us in school, before the papacy ever existed. That's not to say that God could not have warned us about something yet future, as we know Cyrus and Isaiah has talked about, and other cases where Jesus, of course, was prophesied to be born many, many years before that would ever happen. But the point still remains, the language is talking about someone actively doing these things, that is involved in these types of activities, not someone who is yet to do them. And that's the thing that's always stuck out to me.
Yeah, and Brother Camp sicked me onto that idea, and so I started exploring the New Testament with my mind open to just how arrogant is the Jewish high priest anyway. And it suddenly struck me that some of the characteristics that people see in the Roman Catholic Pope that are so offensive were actually copied from the Jewish high priest, with the special garb and the special dress and the special elevated title. And they just borrowed from Judaism and tried to incorporate that into Catholicism. And let me give just some brief examples of how the arrogance of the Jewish high priest jumps off the pages of the New Testament. Take Jesus, for example. In the palace of the high priest, and Jesus is brought to the high priest, accused of blasphemy. And notice the arrogance of the high priest in accusing God, the Son, of blasphemy. You read about it in Matthew chapter 26, 57 to 65. The high priest accused Jesus of blasphemy and said that was reason enough to put him to death. And John's record in John 18, 22 to 24 indicates one of the officers that stood by struck Jesus and said, "Answerest thou the high priest so?" In other words, how dare you talk to the high priest this way? I mean, think about who he's saying that to. He's saying that to the Son of God. Then on another occasion, in the New Testament church, you've got Peter and John hauled before the high priest and many of his kindred that are gathered together in Jerusalem. They demanded for Peter and John to give a defense of healing a lame man in Acts 3. And the record says, actually, of the high priest and his cronies, "And beholding the man which was healed, standing with them," that is Peter and John, "they could say nothing against it." Acts 4:14. They even admit it. A notable miracle has been done by the apostles, and we cannot deny it. Acts 4:16. And yet look at their arrogance. In spite of admitting what that implied, they started trying to bring the hammer down on the apostles and told them, "Don't you dare preach Jesus and the resurrection." And the reaction of the high priest when the apostles were healing everyone that came to them is read in Acts chapter 5. He and the Sadducees, the high priest and the Sadducees, were filled with indignation, so much so they cast the apostles into prison, and the angel of the Lord opened the prison doors and set them free. And not only did the angel set them free, he told them, "Go speak in the temple the words of this life." And so they were out preaching in the temple openly about these things, and the high priest heard about it, hauled them back in. And look at this. "Did not we straitly command you that you should not teach in this name? And behold, you fill Jerusalem with your doctrine and intend to bring this man's blood upon us?" And Peter and the apostles, they won't back down. They said, "We ought to obey God rather than men." And the reaction of the high priest is quite telling here. Acts 5:33. When they heard that, they were cut to the heart and took counsel to slay them. In other words, the high priest and his entourage knew the truth and they suppressed it. Sounds a lot like 2 Thessalonians 2, loving a lie. And these aren't honest folks. They don't love the truth. They love lies.
It's not surprising to think about somebody wanting to eliminate the competition and be the only game in town.
Yeah.
You know, Saul was one that was filled with wrath when he heard the song, Saul has slain his thousands, but David his 10,000s. It was shortly after that Saul tried to kill David in cold blood and destroy the legacy that he was going to have instead, even though David was the Lord's anointed. And David made the statement of, I could have harmed you in a cave, but I'm not going to do that. Then you have Jesus come onto the scene, of course, in the New Testament. Matthew 27 tells us they killed him in part because of envy. And now here we are, New Testament church has started. Members of the church and the apostles are teaching and preaching. And it's a threat, a very big threat to the way of the Judaistic life. And the Jewish high priest has to be thinking in part, I'm going to be out of a job. Not only out of a job, I won't have anybody to worship me and to be able to behave as God and live in a way that is as a deistic person, if you will. And so we need to kill anybody who gets in my way. And then you read 2 Thessalonians, and I think sometimes from my own understanding of this and the study that I've done with it throughout the years, perhaps part of our problem is that we read 2 Thessalonians and we forget that there are other contextual passages that can apply to it. And one of the greatest fears that I know I've talked to you in the past about with expository preaching is if you become too handcuffed to the text you're studying, you forget the context around it and surrounding it in the Bible. I can't help but when you read in the book of Acts and the other passages you just alluded to and discussed, then you read 2 Thessalonians 2 and it just jumps off the page as to who is being described there.
You take Stephen, for example. I mean, he's brought to the high priest who falsely accused him of speaking blasphemous words against Moses and against God. They're very upset about what teaching Stephen's done regarding the temple. And they said to the high priest, we've heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth shall destroy this place and shall change the customs which Moses delivered us, Acts 6:14. And upon hearing those charges, the high priest said, are these things so? Acts 7:1. And Peter's answer to the high priest's question is really the rest of Acts 7. It's a fascinating text. So what was it that incensed the Jews and the high priest? It was the suggestion that the temple would be destroyed, that the customs of Moses would be changed. And as you just noted, that is definitely a wake-up call to the high priest to say that I'm going to be out of a job if that's the case. And I don't think it's inaccurate to say that Stephen's comments concerning the temple were designed to puncture the heart of the very high priest who sat in that temple. Stephen reminds the high priest, quote, the Most High, get that, the Most High. You think you're high priest? Well, there's a higher one than you. The Most High dwells not in temples made with hands, like you do, as saith the prophet, heaven is my throne and earth is my footstool. What house will you build me, saith the Lord? So what's the point Stephen's emphasizing? You could summarize his meaning to be this: Mr. High Priest, you seem so smug of your position, the importance of the building where you're sitting. Well, may I remind you, the Most High has never ascribed to this structure the same degree of importance you have. God doesn't need this temple. Before the temple was ever built, God had a relationship with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses. All those individuals lived pre-temple. God had a good relationship with them. And so Don't trust in the temple. God could have a relationship without it. He can have a relationship with it. You need to trust in God instead of the temples that are made with hands.
The book of Hebrews comes to mind too with Hebrews 4:15. We don't have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was tempted in all points as man is, yet without sin. And I can't help but think of that now when the high priest, and you talk about the Jewish high priest, and yet the Hebrews writer says he's nothing compared to the high priest that really belongs to be in the forefront of our minds.
So much in Hebrews about why Jesus is the superior high priest. And you know, the Saul of Tarsus, before he's converted, was going where to get authority to persecute more believers? To the high priest, right? And so he went to the high priest. Then in his defense after his conversion before men, Paul in Acts 22 says this, I persecuted this way unto the death, binding and delivering into prisons both men and women, as also the high priest does bear me witness. And so years after his conversion, Paul standing before the high priest again, announcing that he had lived in all good conscience before God until that day. At that moment that he said those words, the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood near Paul to smack him on the mouth, smite him on the mouth, punch him in the face. So upon hearing this, Paul says, God shall smite thee, thou whited wall. Watch this. For sittest thou to judge me after the law, and commandest me to be smitten contrary to the law? And so Paul denounces the high priest and says, you may sit in a position. What does 2 Thessalonians 2:4 depict the man of lawlessness as doing? Sitting in the temple. What is this high priest doing here? Paul says you're sitting to judge me after the law, and yet you're not even following the law yourself. And then after Paul's denunciation of the high priest in Acts 23, they stand by and say, what's this? Revilest thou God's high priest? And that's indicative of their ignorance. Ananias was not God's high priest anymore. The truth of the matter is, Jesus was reigning as God's high priest at the point in time they asked this question. And when Paul said, oh, I didn't know he was the high priest, some commentators think he was saying, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know because of my poor eyesight. I really didn't know who I was talking to. No, I think when you study it carefully, Paul is saying, I didn't know you were the high priest because you're not. You're not the high priest anymore.
I love the ability for Paul to then go on in writing, and not with an axe to grind as some type of vendetta, but just a way of saying, you're not who you think you are. And the Spirit's going to then use Paul's pen to write about somebody who is living and behaving in such a way that is not how he should be living and behaving. And it's Paul. It always seems to be Paul that gets the opportunity to kind of call these people out. And I can't help but think about, as this whole podcast is entitled Far Better, it talks about the idea of what Paul wrote in Philippians 1:20-23. I wonder if Paul was thinking back to Stephen, the day that he held the cloaks of the men who were killing him, and Stephen's interaction with all of that. And all of that was done in service to the high priest. And all of the things that Paul was saying in Philippians, where he's like, I get it now. To be with the Lord is far better because he is the high priest. He is the one that I would want to spend my eternity with. Not some man, not some individual who says that he has authority but really doesn't. This is what I wanted to ask you next. I know that it is not impossible for the papacy and really, as you mentioned, a lot of other individuals that have been mentioned to bear similarities to the Jewish high priest. Or the man of sin is what I'm trying to say. But I do think that it's one of those situations where what does the context propose the most? And knowing everything that we know about what we've been studying, it again, I say this as it does to me, it screams off the page
Yeah.
of what was happening, because you read about the Acts of the Apostles and the Jewish high priest and the people who were trying to keep the Judaism ways alive were the biggest threat to Christianity in that time.
Yeah.
And it would seem to be the same in 2 Thessalonians.
And the book of Hebrews, as you mentioned earlier, it was not written to address the existence of the Roman Catholic papacy.
Right.
It was written to address people that were leaving Christianity to go back to what? Judaism. Who's in charge of Judaism at that time? The high priest. Now, if you want to know, and some people think Paul wrote Hebrews, that's not impossible. So just get a little flavor for what he's trying to get these people to realize. Chapter 2:17, Jesus is the merciful and faithful high priest. Chapter 3:1, Jesus is the high priest of our profession. Chapter 4, you mentioned a moment ago, he's the great high priest who's passed into the heavens. So far, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, and chapter 5. Verse 10, he's the high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Chapter 6 and verse 20, the high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Chapter 7, a superior high priest to those of the Levitical order. Hebrews 7, 26 through 28. Chapter 8, he's the high priest on the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, not on earth. Hebrews 8:1. Hebrews 9, he's the high priest of good things to come by a greater and more perfect tabernacle. Chapter 10, he's the high priest over the house of God. Is it possible that one of the reasons the book of Hebrews is focusing so much on Jesus as high priest is because in that day the prevailing misconception was the man sitting in the Jewish temple was still God's high priest?
It seems to make a lot of sense. And I think that when you look at Galatians as well, obviously Paul writing that for sure, saying you can't hold to the old law and expect to go to heaven. Well, why? In part because they weren't holding to what God wanted in the first place. It's always struck me as so sad when you read through the New Testament. What happened?
I didn't do anything.
It's probably fine. We'll splice it together.
Okay.
It's always struck me as interesting that the religious leaders of the day that we read about in the gospel accounts had strayed so far from what God had wanted his people to follow in leadership. They made it all about themselves. You talk about, the Pharisees who made long prayers and tried to be seen of men and all of that mindset. And then I can't help but look at the Jewish high priest and say, you're an issue though with that, because that seems to be how you want to be viewed as well. It's all about me. I'm the most high. I've got the greatest authority among anybody. And as we talked to, growing up, I'm reminded of the movie Remember the Titans. Attitude reflects leadership was the quote that was said to Gary Bertier by Julius. That strikes me as attitude reflects the leadership. What's the attitude of those that are following the leader? Well, it seems to be the exact same as what the leader's being accused of in the book of Acts, in the book of Hebrews, Galatians, talking about you can't have the old law and go to heaven. The prevailing thought of the New Testament is, yes, we need to follow the Savior, but you talk about so many blows to those who were not following the New Testament way. And it's undeniable to me that the Jewish high priest could be the very person being considered in 2 Thessalonians 2.
If you consider the fact that for years after Jesus had purged by himself our sins and sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, there was a human being sitting in his priestly garb in Jerusalem, continuing to enter the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement with animal blood, You couldn't find a better example of counting the blood of the covenant of Christ an unholy thing, Hebrews 10:29. And, one of the points that is made that I really had never thought about before is that after the temple veil was split, and I know you remember that at the crucifixion of Christ and the aftermath of that, the veil of the temple was split. Well, the temple continued on until 70 AD when it was destroyed, and they couldn't continue on anymore. That means at some point someone had to take what God split in two and patch it back together. What arrogance to take something God did and either get a brand new veil or patch that one back together, as if to say, no, we're not going to accept the truth. We're going to keep on keeping on. That's arrogant, and there are a lot of similarities between the arrogance of the Jewish high priesthood and the Roman Catholic papacy.
And certainly the danger in leadership today, that I think the lessons that we would find from this man of sin, of that arrogant mindset, still creeps in certain places. Of course, preachers, we have to be careful of that. How many stories could be told of a preacher who was getting up there in years and the eldership decided to bring in a younger minister, or the eldership hires a youth and family minister or associate minister, whatever title you want to give to it. And at times, the youth and family or associate might have an axe to grind and wants the pulpit, and they may go after the preacher. But there are also times where the preacher begins to be territorial, that has been the pulpit preacher, and almost draws a line in the sand and says, this is my congregation. You don't have any authority. And it reminds me so much of that same mindset of the Jewish high priest, that arrogant mindset of saying, instead of pointing to Christ and saying this is his kingdom, his church, if it benefits the kingdom, I'll yield and step aside and do what needs to be done and serve somewhere else or somehow else. We still have people today, though the Jewish high priest is not the same as it was at the time that this would have been reported, and of course the temple having been destroyed in AD 70, we still have the arrogant attitude of the Jewish high priest existing in our world today, and therefore the man of sin, if you will, proverbially, is alive and well when we take what God has said and set up and try to twist it to be our own benefit.
Yeah, that's very well said. And, I think part of the problem that we have is that we're familiar with the Roman Catholic Pope, and you and I never lived at a time when the Jewish high priest was on earth doing his work. You and I are familiar with the one who offends God today and offends us today, and that is the Jewish, not the Jewish high priest, but the Roman Catholic papacy. And so it's possible for people to get kind of blinded by the culture in which they live as to what the text was about. But try to put yourself in the Thessalonians' sandals. What would they have understood when Paul tells them there was someone sitting in a temple showing arrogance, assuming a position that wasn't rightfully his, and that he would be exposed someday as an imposter, and that his ministry would be canceled? In fact, just to summarize what I've said, I guess, and try to put a bow on it, if you understand the Jewish high priest to be the man of lawlessness, you've got a beautiful harmony that flows through that text. Assume, for the sake of illustration, that the high priest is the lawless one. Then the destruction of Jerusalem fits several criteria in 2 Thessalonians 2. It would have most certainly unveiled the high priest in all of his naked deformity. It would have demonstrated his claim to be God's high priest was fraudulent. And one of the definitions given for the word slay is the cancellation of a ministry. I'm telling you, the destruction of the Jewish temple, where the high priest sat, most assuredly canceled his ministry. And you've observed as you study the text that the breath of God is often associated with God's coming in judgment upon nations. So it's possible to regard the destruction of Jerusalem as an exhibition of the punishing breath of God. And the prevailing definition of rendering ineffectual, useless, inoperative, robbing one of his force and effectiveness, that makes verse 8 deprive the man of sin of all significance. And that was done when Jesus paralyzed the man of sin and stripped him of his power by destroying the temple. That completely destroyed the high priesthood on earth. And there's no one to this day that can carry out being the high priest.
And let's say that just because someone may say this that listens in the future, why didn't Paul just come out and say who it was? Well, number one, the Spirit evidently didn't want him to be blatant in saying who it was specifically. Otherwise, he would have recorded it was the Jewish high priest by name. There's also instances in the Bible where Paul condemns a sinful activity or practice without name calling or name dropping. 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 11, he lists a host of different issues that will keep someone from going to heaven. And he doesn't say, and here are all the people that I know that are involved in every single one of these things. He just says, these people, who some of you used to behave like, don't inherit the kingdom. So it's obvious that it is a possibility that it was just a statement of, like you mentioned, hey, those in Thessalonica, those of you reading it, you'll know. I don't have to tell you, you know. And there have been so many times in my preaching, and I know in yours and so many other preachers I speak to, where they tell a story of a sermon they had to preach at a congregation where the church knew what the preacher was talking about, but he never even had to get up and blatantly say it because it was so obvious to them, the listeners.
Especially, as you noted in 2 Thessalonians 2:5, Paul says, remember when I was with you?
Yes.
I told you about this. We know not what they knew as far as what he said to them, but we do have a flavor for it. It's almost like listening to a phone conversation and only hearing one side of it. You can get bits and pieces that clue you into what the subject matter is, but you don't have the full high definition understanding of it. And so we know enough, though, to know that Paul was making clear that there was going to be a cancellation of the ministry of the man of lawlessness, and Jesus Christ has already accomplished that.
Well, and I've always found this to be a very enamored topic. I've been enamored by it, I guess I should say, and it is an interesting one to consider because, as I mentioned toward the beginning of this episode, one of the issues that I take so much today with some Bible views that are brought forth, and we covered one just recently here on the network and on this podcast with the new heavens and new earth. There's a lot of things that are said that then a lot of manipulation of the scriptures takes place to make what has been said come true or be true. With this, I have not found, not just because of our relationship or even as student and teacher when you taught me, I've asked other students that have gone through the school what they think about this position. And so many of them say the exact same thing to the exact same degree. I used to think it was the papacy because that made so much sense. It's what I was always taught. But then as I sat through and I listened and I read through that thesis in the premillennialism class that we were taught, how to define and defeat these things, it just screamed at me. This makes so much sense. And I'm appreciative of the fact that outside of the sources that you've used to support what you found in Scripture, the majority of what we've covered in this episode has been based on context of the Bible.
Right.
And so I want to say this, and then I'll let you say anything else before we close. To those that are listening to this, that are wanting to preach or that are actively being involved in preaching, make this the goal with every sermon and class that you teach, that you study the context to the best of your ability to know it inside and out. Because think of what has been missed by so many people who have never considered, like Brother Camp first taught you and kind of turned you on to, and yours studying this thesis, and so many others who have studied this viewpoint as well. That's been missed by just saying, well, this is just what 2 Thessalonians 2 says. But what about Acts and Matthew and all of the other Hebrews, all of the other things that we've brought out? Those count for something too. And so I'm appreciative of the effort that was put into this, and I'm thankful for you being with us. Do you have anything else you want to say?
I would say I totally understand why some people look at the Roman Catholic papacy and think, aha, that's it. But I think what they forgot is what I also had not known, and that was, now I understand the Roman Catholic papacy does possess those characteristics, but they didn't possess it first. They borrowed it. They copied it. And the one that possessed it at the time Paul wrote the Thessalonians, the one with whom they would have identified, he couldn't have already told them about the Pope existing because the Pope didn't yet exist, but they did know full well there was a Jewish high priest, and they did know the law was taken out of the way, and they did know that the temple was going to be destroyed to try to get people to quit trying to practice the law of Moses. And that was much more contextual for them, and it gets the job done.
Absolutely. Well, this concludes our 2-season study on premillennialism. I hope and pray that those of you that listened every week benefited from it. One of the main reasons I decided to do these 2 seasons on this was I've always enjoyed the study of this topic. I've always enjoyed the different tenets that make it up, and it always changes. There's hardly ever anything that stays exactly the same, but there are some pieces of it that obviously that do. But there's so many different viewpoints and brands of premillennialism. But it is one of those things where I thought if I'm about to conclude a topical podcast, I should end it with a topical study. And so next week, this program will come to an end, and we'll close out the show together. And then the following week will be the brand new program, Text Takeaways. Thankful to House Studios for filming that in Dalton, Georgia. They'll be on YouTube as well as the normal podcast setup. We'll be studying the book of 1 John. And so, yes, when we get to it in 1 John, we will talk about the Antichrist some more, but I promise not near as long as we talked about it the last 2 seasons. Dad, thanks for being with us again this week, and we'll be looking forward to next week when we close this show out and put a ribbon on it. So for the penultimate episode of Far Better, don't forget to please God now so our eternity can be far better.